On Thanksgiving Day, my millionaire son visited me and asked, "Did you like the lake house I gave you, Mom?" In shock, I replied, "What house? I never received anything." My gold digger Dill slowly walked up to him. The morning air in Des Moines was sharp, crisp, and unforgiving. Frost clung to the edges of Margaret's narrow apartment window like lace. Outside, the trees stood bare, their branches stiff against the pale gray sky. Thanksgiving had arrived, but for Margaret, it was just another Thursday dressed in memories. She wrapped a knitted shawl around her shoulders, one she had made during the long evenings of last winter, and turned on her small radio, which played soft instrumental jazz, filling the quiet of her one-bedroom apartment with something that almost resembled company. She moved slowly through her kitchen, methodically pulling out the ingredients for her pumpkin pie. She had made the same pie every year for the past 4 decades, but this year, the gesture felt more like a ritual of remembrance than a celebration. The canned pumpkin puree, condensed milk, nutmeg, and cinnamon were all lined up with care. She stirred gently, taking her time, the aroma of the spices conjuring up flickers of Thanksgiving's past, her husband's booming laugh, her son's tiny hands stealing pecans from the counter, the warmth of a home now long gone. Her fingers ached slightly from the cold, despite the heater buzzing in the corner of the room. She glanced at the small clock above the stove, 10 o'clock in the morning. Too early for any visitors, but not too early to start hoping. She told herself she wasn't expecting Brian, not really. Her son, once her pride and joy, had drifted so far away from her life that his appearances had become like shooting stars, rare, brief, and dazzling. A call once every few months, a card in the mail, the occasional bouquet of flowers on her birthday, always ordered online. He was a millionaire now, wrapped in a world of polished offices, glittering events, and a glamorous wife she had only met twice. Still, she had set the table for 3. Just in case. She folded a napkin with delicate precision and placed it beside the plate across from her own. The third plate was more a gesture than a plan, a silent invitation. She remembered the last time Brian had visited, 2 years ago, the week before his wedding. He had stayed for only 20 minutes, apologizing profusely as he scrolled through his phone and promised to bring Tiffany by someday soon. "She's busy, Mom, but next time, I swear. She wants to meet you properly." Margaret had smiled then, not because she believed him, but because that was what mothers did. The pie was finally in the oven, and she leaned back into the worn fabric of her kitchen chair, breathing in the sweet, spicy scent. She closed her eyes for a moment. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe he would remember. Maybe the holiday meant something to him still. The thought passed quickly, chased away by the cautious voice that always reminded her not to get her hopes up. She spent the next hour straightening up the apartment, dusting the photo frames on the mantel, fluffing the pillows, adjusting the throw blanket on the couch for the 4th time. The photos were all from another lifetime, Brian as a toddler in overalls, her late husband smiling beside their old Chevy truck, a faded picture of the 3 of them at the lake from a summer that now felt like a dream. Margaret touched the edge of the frame lightly and whispered, "He loved it there." By noon, the sky had darkened, and snowflakes began to fall, soft and slow. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the city blur into white. The phone didn't ring. No messages. No knock at the door. She began to accept what she already knew, that she would be alone again this year. Still, she set the pie out on the windowsill to cool, placed the dinner rolls in a cloth-lined bowl, and ladled gravy into a ceramic dish she only used for special occasions. She lit the candles. The flicker of the flame danced against the windowpane, reflecting back the image of a woman holding on to tradition more than hope. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, she sat down at the table and clasped her hands together, bowing her head. "Thank you," she whispered, "for the memories. And for another year." Her voice trembled just slightly, but she steadied it with a long breath. Then came the sound she hadn't dared to expect, a car pulling into the driveway. She looked up, heart suddenly pounding. She stood slowly, walked to the window, and parted the curtain. A sleek black SUV had stopped in front of her building. She squinted. The driver's door opened. A tall man stepped out, wearing a charcoal wool coat and a familiar smile. Brian. Behind him, a woman emerged, tall, blonde, impeccably dressed in a cream-colored trench coat and heels far too delicate for the snowy sidewalk. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. She took a step back from the window, her breath catching. They were here. For the first time in years, her son was home on Thanksgiving Day. Margaret opened the door before they even reached it. Her fingers trembled against the brass knob, not from the cold but from the rush of disbelief coursing through her. Brian stood on the threshold with that boyish smile she hadn't seen in years. Behind him, Tiffany adjusted her coat, eyes scanning the modest hallway like she had just stepped into a foreign museum. "Hi, Mom," Brian said, holding out a bouquet of orange lilies and white chrysanthemums, the same kind she used to grow in the backyard of their old house. "Happy Thanksgiving." She took the flowers, her voice caught somewhere between her throat and her heart. "You came," she finally managed, barely louder than a whisper. "I told you I'd surprise you one of these years," he replied with a grin. Tiffany stepped forward with a stiff smile and leaned in for an air kiss that barely grazed Margaret's cheek. "It smells festive," Tiffany said, her eyes settling briefly on the pie cooling on the sill before flicking over the room. "Very cozy." Brian stepped inside, rubbing his hands together. "It's freezing out there. Hope you've got something strong to drink." Margaret offered a warm chuckle and motioned them into the small living room. "There's cider on the stove," she said, "but I can make coffee if you'd like something warmer." "This is fine," Brian said. "Sit with us, Mom." She set the flowers in a vase quickly, heart pounding with an odd mix of excitement and caution. Something about Tiffany's demeanor unsettled her. The younger woman's eyes moved with too much calculation, her smile too sharp around the edges. Still, she brushed the thought away. Brian was here. That was what mattered. They sat at the table, the pie between them. Brian complimented the crust, said it reminded him of childhood. Tiffany picked at the edge of her plate, uninterested. Then, as casually as if commenting on the weather, Brian turned to her and said, "So, what did you think of the lake house?" The words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret blinked. I'm sorry?" she asked, unsure if she had misheard. Brian tilted his head. "The lake house, Mom. At Okoboji. The one I bought for you." A silence fell over the table, thick and strange. Margaret stared at him. "I don't know what you're talking about." Brian's smile faltered. "The house. I told the realtor to handle everything. Sent over all the paperwork months ago. Tiffany said she was helping coordinate the move. You never got it?" Margaret looked at Tiffany, whose expression had stiffened into a mask of feigned confusion. "That must be a misunderstanding," Tiffany said, her tone bright but tight. "I thought we agreed to wait a bit before surprising her. You know, so everything would be just right." Brian frowned. "No, I said I wanted her to have it right away." "I told you that." Tiffany laughed nervously. "Did you?" Maybe we misunderstood each other. So many things going on lately. Travel, meetings. It must have gotten mixed up." Margaret shook her head slowly. "Brian. I've never received any papers. No keys. Nothing. This is the first time I'm hearing about a house." He sat back, clearly puzzled. "That's impossible. I signed everything. It's in your name. I'll show you." He stood and went to the hallway, returning with a leather folder from the car. Tiffany's gaze sharpened, but she didn't move. Margaret unfolded the documents, her hands trembling again, not from emotion this time, but confusion. There it was in black and white. A lakefront property on the western edge of Lake Okoboji. Purchased 6 months ago. Transferred to her name. Yet she had never set eyes on it. Brian leaned over her shoulder. "See? This is yours, Mom. I wanted to give you something peaceful. I remember how much you loved that lake." Her eyes scanned the paperwork, and then something caught her attention. The mailing address for correspondence, it was not hers. It was an address she didn't recognize. "Brian," she said slowly, "this address, it's not mine." He looked closer. "That's not your apartment." "Wait, that's..." Tiffany stood abruptly, brushing her hands against her skirt. "I think I need a drink of that cider," she said lightly, turning toward the kitchen without waiting for permission. Brian didn't take his eyes off the paper. "This is your address, isn't it, Tiff?" She didn't turn around. "I had everything forwarded to me so I could make sure it all went smoothly," she said, a little too quickly. "I didn't want your mom getting bogged down in the logistics." Margaret narrowed her eyes. "You changed the contact address?" "I didn't change anything," Tiffany replied, now visibly flustered. "I just arranged it so everything would go through me first. For convenience." Brian stood up slowly, the pieces beginning to shift in his expression. "You never told me that." Tiffany turned, arms crossed. "You said you wanted her to be surprised. I figured I'd get the place cleaned up, furnished, and then, bam, surprise her with a ribbon on the front door." "That was 6 months ago," Brian said flatly. "You've had 6 months." Margaret sat frozen, the documents resting in her lap. Her stomach felt hollow, as though someone had just carved out all the air inside her. "Brian," she said softly, "I never knew this existed. Not until this moment." He looked at her, then back at Tiffany, his voice quiet now. "Did you ever take her there?" "I was waiting," Tiffany said. "It was supposed to be a gift, remember? Gifts take time." "But I already gave the gift," he said. "I transferred the title." "You didn't need to wait." Tiffany's jaw tightened. "Look, maybe it wasn't perfect, but I was trying to make it special. If that's a crime now, I'm sorry." Brian's expression darkened. "Why do I feel like you're not telling me something?" Tiffany gave a short, dry laugh. "You're acting like I stole the place." Margaret felt the weight of the folder in her lap as though it were filled with lead. She looked up at her son and said, in a voice that cut through the awkward air, "Brian, who paid the property taxes? Where were they sent?" He looked down at the documents again, flipping to a page near the back. His face paled. "They were sent to that same address," he said quietly. "And they've already been paid. In full." Tiffany spoke quickly. "I handled that. I didn't want your mom dealing with bills." "You paid with my account?" he asked sharply. "I used the household account." "What's the difference?" Brian didn't answer. He sat back down, hands steepled together, staring at the table. The clock in the kitchen ticked loudly into the silence. Margaret finally stood, placing a hand gently on her son's shoulder. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice steady. "But I think there's more to this story than we know." Brian nodded once, slowly. His eyes lifted toward Tiffany, who now stood stiffly in the doorway. She said nothing. But the mask was starting to crack. The atmosphere in the room had shifted, palpably heavier, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Margaret stood silently at the edge of the kitchen, her hand still resting on the back of Brian's chair. She could feel the tension ripple through the air as Tiffany pretended to busy herself by adjusting the cuffs of her coat, as though smoothing the fabric would somehow flatten the mounting suspicion in the room. Brian, however, remained seated, his elbows on the table, his fingers loosely clasped as his eyes followed his wife with a quiet intensity. Tiffany turned toward the window and stared out at the street, pretending not to feel the weight of both their gazes pressing into her back. Margaret didn't speak, and Brian said nothing more for a long, stretching minute. The silence was loud, it accused, it questioned, and it waited. Finally, unable to bear the quiet any longer, Tiffany spoke without turning around. Look, maybe it wasn't the best way to do things. But I didn't think it would turn into some sort of inquisition. Her voice had lost its earlier luster. Now, there was a trace of unease creeping through each word, subtle but noticeable. Brian didn't flinch. Why didn't you tell me she never saw the house? Tiffany slowly turned, arms folded, her posture rigid. Because I thought it wasn't important yet. We were going to plan a trip. I even talked to the decorator about it. But then you got busy with the new product launch, and your mother's health. Margaret cut her off, voice calm but direct. My health has been stable, dear. No one told me about a house. No invitations, no decorator, no mention at all. So why are you making it sound like I was the one dragging my feet? Tiffany blinked rapidly, her carefully composed expression faltering for a fraction of a second. Well, I mean, you're always saying how you don't want to leave Des Moines. I figured maybe you weren't ready. Brian's voice was low now. That wasn't your decision to make. The statement hung like an icicle between them. Tiffany's jaw tensed, but she didn't respond. She walked to the sideboard and poured herself a glass of cider, taking a sip as if that would buy her time to think. Margaret stepped back toward the hallway, her fingers brushing lightly against the wall as if grounding herself. Brian, may I speak with you in the other room? He nodded immediately and followed her into the modest living room, just far enough to be out of Tiffany's earshot. Margaret kept her voice low, though her eyes burned with a quiet fury. I don't want to accuse anyone of anything without proof, she said, but something here doesn't make sense. If the house was meant for me, why has she been handling everything in secret? Brian rubbed a hand over his jaw. I trusted her to coordinate things. I didn't think she'd. I don't know. Hide it. Redirect paperwork. She told me it was all taken care of. Margaret watched her son carefully. And have you ever seen the house yourself? He shook his head. No. I was supposed to go with her the weekend she finalized the purchase, but something came up with the app launch. She said she'd handle it. Margaret exhaled slowly. I think you should look at the house. Yourself. With your own eyes. Brian nodded again, more firmly this time. You're right. But I need to know what else she's not telling me. When they returned to the kitchen, Tiffany was seated, sipping from her cider as though nothing had happened. She looked up and smiled faintly, but the strain around her eyes betrayed her. Brian sat across from her and leaned forward. Have you been to the lake house since we bought it? He asked. Tiffany hesitated, then shrugged. I stopped by. Once or twice. Just to check on things. Margaret stepped closer. Do you mind if I ask, did you take anyone with you? Friends? Tiffany's smile thinned. What does that have to do with anything? Brian's gaze sharpened. It has everything to do with it. Tiffany pushed her glass aside, her patience thinning. All right, yes. I hosted a small gathering there. Once. It was harmless. Some of the girls from my Pilates group wanted a weekend getaway, and the place was empty. I figured, why not? Margaret's voice was quiet but firm. And you didn't think to mention it to the person whose name is on the deed? Tiffany stood abruptly, as if unable to stay seated under their scrutiny. This is ridiculous. It was supposed to be a gift. You're all acting like I committed fraud. No one said that, Brian said calmly. But the fact that you're acting so defensive makes me wonder what you're hiding. I'm not hiding anything, she snapped. I tried to make things special, and now I'm being interrogated like some criminal. Then help us understand, Margaret said. Where are the keys? Where are the receipts? Who paid for the furniture, the utilities, the maintenance? Tiffany looked between them, her confidence visibly eroding. I don't have everything on me. I'd have to check my files. Brian's voice was cooler now. Then do that. Because right now, this doesn't look good. There was a knock at the door. All three turned their heads. Margaret stepped forward, puzzled. She wasn't expecting anyone. She opened it to find an elderly woman in a beige coat holding a tin of cookies and a wide smile. "Happy Thanksgiving, Margaret," said Mrs. Hendricks from down the hall. "I thought you might like some snickerdoodles." Margaret smiled warmly despite the tension thick in her apartment. "That's so kind, Helen." "Thank you." As she took the tin, Helen peeked inside and saw Brian and Tiffany standing tensely near the table. "Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt. I'll let you get back to your guests." But before she turned, she added, "You know, I've been meaning to ask, was that your daughter-in-law I saw coming and going with those big delivery trucks last month? I thought maybe you were moving." The word struck like a thunderclap. Margaret froze. "What trucks?" Helen tilted her head. "Oh, just some moving vans. A couple of them. Parked right outside for hours. The men were carrying in furniture. I assumed it was for you." Margaret looked at Tiffany. Tiffany's face was pale. Brian stepped forward. "You were moving furniture into the lake house." Tiffany's silence said more than any denial. It was only the beginning. The apartment seemed smaller now, crowded not by people, but by the sudden, undeniable presence of doubt. Mrs. Hendricks had already returned to her unit, her tin now sitting untouched on the counter. The brief sound of her door clicking shut echoed faintly down the hallway. Margaret stood motionless, her hand still holding the edge of the doorway as if steadying herself against a truth slowly blooming in her chest. Brian turned to Tiffany, his eyes narrowed and searching, and what he saw made something inside him go very still. "You moved furniture in?" he asked, voice steady, almost too calm. Tiffany opened her mouth, but no sound came. Her eyes darted from him to Margaret, then back again, trying to read how deep the damage was, how far the illusion had already unraveled. "I had to furnish the place," she said finally, too quickly. "It came empty. What was I supposed to do, leave it with bare walls?" Margaret didn't speak. She just moved slowly to the sideboard, opened a drawer, and took out a notepad. She scribbled something, tore off the sheet, and handed it to Brian. "Call this number," she said quietly. "It's from the paperwork you showed me earlier. The name of the real estate office." Brian took the slip of paper. Tiffany stepped forward, suddenly panicked. "What are you doing?" "Getting some clarity," he replied, pulling out his phone. "I already told you everything," Tiffany said, voice raised. "Why don't you believe me?" "Because everything I learn makes less sense than the last thing," he said, his tone still even, but his grip on the phone was tight. "And right now, I need to hear from someone who doesn't have a reason to lie." Tiffany's mouth opened, but the argument died before it was spoken. Brian stepped away toward the living room, placing the call with deliberate calm. Margaret watched her daughter-in-law carefully. Tiffany crossed her arms and turned away slightly, jaw clenched, the performance faltering at the edges. Brian's voice was low, professional. He confirmed the name on the documents, the address, and asked to speak to someone familiar with the transaction. After a pause, he asked another question, and his tone changed. "Yes. I understand. And she was present during the closing?" A beat passed. "I see. And has she returned since?" Another pause. "With guests?" Tiffany didn't move, but her eyes flicked toward Brian's back. She couldn't hear the other side of the call, but it didn't take much to guess what was being said. Her fingers dug into the sleeves of her sweater. Brian ended the call and turned around. His face was unreadable, which made it even more unsettling. "They confirmed Tiffany was there," he said slowly. "Several times. Not just for staging the house. And not alone." Margaret's eyes stayed on Tiffany. "Who did you bring?" Tiffany pressed her lips together, then smiled thinly. "Friends. A couple of times. You make it sound like I hosted a parade. You lied, Brian said flatly. You told me the house was untouched, waiting for Mom. But you've been using it like it was yours. It is ours, she snapped, suddenly defensive. What's the difference? It's under her name, sure, but we all know it came from you. So technically. No, Margaret interrupted, voice sharp and cutting. Technically, it belongs to me. That's not a detail. That's the entire point. Brian crossed his arms, his posture heavy with disappointment. You never planned to give it to her, did you? Tiffany hesitated, and for a fraction of a second, her face betrayed the truth. That single pause answered the question. Margaret inhaled slowly, then exhaled with a quiet firmness. I want to see the house. Tiffany blinked. What? I want to see it, she repeated. With my own eyes. You've spent more time there than I have, and that's not right. If it's mine, I want to understand what it's become. Brian nodded immediately. We'll go tomorrow. I'll drive. Tiffany scoffed. Are you serious? In this weather? Margaret turned toward her. If it's good enough for your Pilates friends, it's good enough for me. Tiffany looked away, her expression curdling. Fine, she muttered. But don't expect a red carpet. No one responded. The rest of the afternoon passed in an uneasy quiet. They ate in near silence, save for the clatter of utensils and the occasional forced comment from Tiffany about the food. Margaret didn't taste a single bite. Her mind was already turning over possibilities, questions, and the sinking realization that something she'd never asked for had been taken from her before she even knew it existed. As dusk fell, Brian offered to take the dishes to the sink, while Tiffany remained seated, arms folded, staring at the untouched slice of pie on her plate. Margaret stepped away and returned with the folder of documents. She sat beside her son and began examining each page more closely now, not just for what was there, but for what was missing. There's no utility bills in here, she said. No receipts. Nothing about furniture or movers. Brian frowned. If she paid with the household card, there should be records. He opened his banking app, scrolling through recent expenses, while Tiffany suddenly stood and walked to the window. She pulled the curtain slightly as though checking the street, but Margaret knew it was only a distraction. There, Brian said. 3 large purchases from a luxury furniture outlet in Omaha. $5,000, then another $4,000 2 weeks later. Same vendor. She said she went to Omaha for a conference last month, Margaret murmured. Brian kept scrolling. And this, a cleaning service listed under the Lake Properties zip code. Twice a week. Going back months. Tiffany turned. You're spying on me now? No, Brian said coolly. I'm finally paying attention. Her face flushed with anger. So I made the place nice. So what? I didn't throw wild parties, I didn't wreck anything. You just took it, Margaret interrupted. You didn't ask. You didn't tell. You took something meant for someone else and lived in it like it was yours. It was empty. Tiffany shouted. What was I supposed to do, let it sit there collecting dust while you tried to figure out how to use a microwave without breaking it? The room went still. Brian stood slowly. You need to leave. Tiffany stared at him. What? He repeated, quietly. Go home. I'll meet you tomorrow. But tonight, leave. She laughed, but it was hollow. You're siding with her? She's my mother, Brian said. And I gave her that house. You treated it like a vacation rental. I don't know what else you've done, but I'm going to find out. Tiffany didn't argue. She grabbed her coat, muttered something neither of them could hear, and slammed the door behind her. Brian stood still for a long moment, then turned to Margaret, who remained seated, hands folded in her lap. Do you still want to see it? He asked softly. Margaret nodded. Yes. Tomorrow. Early. They didn't speak much after that. The quiet returned, but it was different now, not filled with uncertainty, but with a sense of resolution. There were answers waiting by that lake. And both of them were finally ready to face them. The following morning arrived cloaked in fog. The streets of Des Moines were quiet in the early hours, with only the faint hum of distant traffic and the occasional echo of a garbage truck breaking the stillness. Margaret stood by her small bedroom window, watching the gray light stretch slowly across the sky. She had hardly slept. The events of the previous day had churned through her thoughts all night, their implications growing heavier with every passing hour. She dressed in silence, choosing her thick wool coat and boots she hadn't worn in years, and braided her silver hair tightly behind her head. At precisely 7 o'clock in the morning, Brian pulled up in front of her building in the same black SUV as the day before. He looked like he had slept even less than she had. There were shadows beneath his eyes, and his jaw was set with quiet determination. Margaret climbed in without a word, fastening her seatbelt as he merged onto the road heading northwest. The drive to Lake Okoboji would take over 3 hours, but neither of them seemed in the mood for small talk. They rode in silence for the first hour, the miles passing under wheels and silence. Then, as the road curved past a small township, Margaret broke the quiet. "When you gave her access to your accounts," she said, not turning her head, "did you set limits?" Brian exhaled. "We had a joint household account. I told her to use it for groceries, home stuff, occasional travel. Not thousands of dollars in designer furniture. Not weekly cleaning services for a property she told me we weren't using yet." Margaret nodded, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. She was methodical. Not impulsive. "That's what bothers me the most," he replied. She wasn't being careless. She was careful. She wanted control over the house, and she made sure you were never a part of it. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. "Then let's find out how far it went." They reached the town of Okoboji just before 10. The fog had lifted, revealing a serene lakeside community with quiet homes spaced along winding roads. Brian followed the GPS, turning onto a long gravel driveway flanked by pines. At the end stood a modern, 2-story cabin with cedar siding and large glass windows overlooking the lake. The house was beautiful, striking in its design, but more than that, it looked lived in. Margaret's eyes scanned the front porch, the planters filled with winter evergreens, the welcome mat that read, "The B Family," in cursive script. A sudden wave of cold moved through her chest. "That's not our name," she said. Brian parked and turned to look. "No, it's not." They got out. The front door was locked, and when Brian pulled out the key from the envelope he had brought, Margaret saw his hands tremble slightly. The lock clicked, and the door opened with a soft push. Inside, the house was immaculate. Tastefully decorated in a neutral palette of beige, cream, and soft gray, it had every hallmark of a curated home: plush rugs, custom lighting fixtures, oversized furniture that looked both expensive and barely used. But what caught Margaret's eye were the details. A monogrammed blanket draped over the arm of the couch, wine bottles arranged artfully in the built-in rack, picture frames. She stepped closer. The frames held photos she'd never seen before: Tiffany smiling beside a group of women in swimsuits on the deck, Tiffany holding a glass of champagne near the fireplace, Tiffany curled beside a golden retriever that Margaret didn't recognize. "She staged a life here," Margaret whispered. Brian didn't answer. He walked past her into the kitchen, opened a drawer, and pulled out a folder. Inside were receipts, letters from the Homeowners Association, even thank-you notes from rental guests. She was renting it out, he said. At least 3 different weekends. "Look." Margaret took one of the letters and read aloud. "Thanks for the amazing stay, Tiffany. The view was incredible, and the wine selection was so thoughtful. Hope we can come again next year." She turned it into a luxury rental, Brian muttered. "All under your name." Margaret set the letter down slowly. I want to see everything. They moved through the house, room by room. The master bedroom had a walk-in closet filled with clothes, all of them in Tiffany's size and style. Perfume bottles lined the vanity. A silk robe was draped across the bed. In one of the guest rooms, Margaret found a stack of magazines, each one dog-eared to articles about short-term rental income, property staging tips, and how to manage multiple listings. Beside them, a notepad filled with Tiffany's handwriting, prices, dates, maintenance notes. She was running a business out of this, Margaret said, her voice hollow. Brian rubbed his forehead. How did I not see this? Margaret stepped toward a bookshelf in the corner of the room. Nestled among the books was a stack of unopened envelopes. She recognized the real estate firm's logo on several of them. She opened one, finding a tax notice addressed not to her apartment in Des Moines, but to the lake house itself. And then she noticed something else, an envelope with her name, written in Brian's handwriting. It was sealed. Brian, she called. He turned. She handed him the envelope, her heart already sinking. He took it, eyes scanning the handwriting, then looked back up at her. I sent this. When? 7 months ago. He tore it open and read the note. His own words stared back at him. Mom, I wanted to surprise you. This house is yours. You don't have to do anything, just go. It's waiting for you. I wanted you to have something beautiful again. Love, Brian. Margaret's throat closed. I never got it. It was mailed here, he said. To this address. She intercepted it, Margaret whispered. From the beginning. They stood there for a long time in silence. Everything was clear now. Every moment Tiffany had played the loving daughter-in-law, every smile, every holiday absence, every excuse. It had all been designed to ensure Margaret never stepped foot in the one place Brian had created for her. I'm so sorry, Brian said, voice cracking. Margaret touched his arm gently. You didn't know. But now we do. He looked around, taking in the house not as a gift anymore, but as a stolen thing reclaimed. We'll make it right, he said. From this day forward. Margaret walked to the window and looked out over the lake. The water was still, calm, reflecting the pale blue of the sky. For the first time, she imagined herself here, in the quiet, among the trees, with nothing hidden. We already are, she said. This is mine now. And I'm going to live in it. Brian nodded. We'll start fresh. No more secrets. But he wasn't finished yet. There was still one more call he needed to make. As Brian stood in the hallway of the lake house, still holding the now unsealed envelope addressed to his mother, a fresh and bitter understanding began to settle over him. Tiffany had hidden more than a letter. She had hidden his intentions, rewritten his gesture of love into a selfish opportunity, and crafted a narrative that excluded his mother entirely. Every step she took in the house had been made with the confidence of someone who didn't believe she'd ever be questioned. But now, the questions had found their voice. Margaret remained by the living room window, quiet but visibly grounded in the space. She didn't speak again for several minutes, her gaze lost in the still waters of the lake, but her silence was not the silence of despair. It was one of awakening. I want to speak to someone from that office, she said finally, turning to face her son. Someone who dealt directly with her. Brian nodded without hesitation. He took out his phone again, scrolled back to the number he had called the day before, and asked to be connected to the agent responsible for the closing of the house. After a brief pause, a woman named Kara answered. Brian placed the call on speaker and gestured for Margaret to come closer. Kara, he began, this is Brian. We spoke yesterday. I'm here at the lake property now, and I'm with my mother, Margaret. She has a few questions. Of course, Kara replied. Her tone was professional but curious. I'd like to confirm something, Margaret said, her voice firm. Were any documents ever signed in my presence, or sent to my apartment in Des Moines? No, ma'am, Kara said. All documents were forwarded to the address we were given by Mrs. Blake, that is, your daughter-in-law. We were told to use that address for all correspondence and delivery. Did she present herself as my representative? Margaret asked. Yes. She signed as your proxy. We were under the impression you had authorized her to act on your behalf. Brian's jaw tightened. But I never gave her power of attorney. Neither did my mother. There was a brief silence. Well, Kara replied slowly, then I suggest you check the notarized forms. If they exist, someone submitted fraudulent documentation. Because that's how everything was processed, under the assumption she had full authority. Brian's hand dropped to his side. Margaret stood a little straighter. Could you email us a copy of what she submitted? Absolutely, Kara said. Give me 10 minutes. They ended the call, and Brian moved toward the dining table, opening his laptop. He connected to the mobile hotspot and logged into his email. True to her word, Kara's message arrived within minutes. Attached were 2 scanned forms, one labeled Authorization of Proxy, and the other, a document supposedly granting Tiffany temporary power of attorney. As Margaret leaned over to look, she saw her own name scrawled in shaky cursive, but it wasn't her handwriting. This is forged, she said immediately. I never signed anything like this. Brian compared it to an old birthday card she had sent him, which he'd scanned years ago. The difference was obvious. The loops, the angles, the pressure, it wasn't even close. She faked your signature, he said. They stared at the screen for a moment. Brian reached into his coat pocket and took out a small notebook where he often scribbled down thoughts and numbers. He flipped to a clean page, wrote down the name of a legal contact he knew from his corporate dealings, and circled it. I'm not letting this go, he said. Not just for your sake, but for mine. She crossed a line that can't be walked back. I want to take this one step at a time, Margaret said. And I'd like to speak to someone myself. Someone who can confirm whether she misused my name. Brian nodded. Let's do it. Later that afternoon, they drove into town and stopped at the local real estate office. Kara met them personally, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 30s with a calm, clipped voice. She led them into a small conference room and pulled up the original transaction files. She signed on this line, Kara explained, pointing at the screen. But as you can see, the signature doesn't match this ID we have scanned from your mother's driver's license. We flagged it at the time, but Mrs. Blake insisted you had signed in person at her residence and couldn't come due to illness. Lies, Margaret said calmly. I see that now, Kara replied. Brian looked at her. Would you be willing to provide a statement confirming this discrepancy? Kara didn't hesitate. I'll have it ready by tomorrow morning. Back in the SUV, Margaret sat quietly, watching the lake shimmer in the early afternoon sun. She finally turned to Brian. Let's go home. But tomorrow, we speak to a lawyer. The return trip was somber but resolved. Tiffany hadn't just lied, she had manipulated systems, used official channels to construct a legal barrier around something that wasn't hers. Her actions weren't simply selfish. They were criminal. That evening, after dinner in Margaret's apartment, Brian left briefly to retrieve a few more documents from his office in the city. While he was gone, Margaret sat with the folder again, reviewing each line with the sharp attention of someone who had spent years balancing budgets on a fixed income. One document caught her eye, a property management agreement. She hadn't noticed it before. It listed a phone number, separate from the real estate office, and a note at the bottom, Luxury Lakeside Retreats, exclusive rental partner. Margaret picked up the phone and dialed. Luxury Lakeside, this is Deborah, came a chipper voice on the other end. Hello, Deborah, Margaret said. I'm inquiring about the property listed at Lakeshore Drive. Can you tell me how long it's been available on your platform? Oh, certainly, Deborah replied. Let me check. Yes, it's been active for 5 months now. It's been one of our most popular winter listings, booked solid most weekends. Do you have the name of the person who registered the property? Yes, ma'am. That would be Tiffany Blake. Thank you, Margaret said, her tone tight. As she hung up, she saw Brian stepping through the door. She looked up at him with clear eyes. She's been making money off my house, Margaret said. 4 months. Brian walked to the table, set down his briefcase, and took a long breath. Then she's about to find out what it means to take from the wrong person. Because now, Margaret wasn't just a passive figure on the sidelines of her son's life. She was the legal owner of a property used to commit deception, and she intended to take back every piece of it, with interest. And for Tiffany, the cracks in her carefully built illusion were no longer hidden. They were spreading fast. It was just after 9 o'clock the following morning when Brian stood outside the front door of the home he shared with Tiffany. The air was cold, the sky blanketed with a dull, wintry overcast that matched the weight pressing against his chest. In his coat pocket were printed copies of the forged documents, the rental listing screenshots, and the notarized statements from the real estate office. In his other hand, he clutched his phone, open to a gallery of photos, not of vacations or memories, but of Tiffany's carefully curated life inside the lake house. Photos she had posted once and thought she'd deleted, but not before they were archived online. He stood for a long moment before unlocking the door. The house was quiet. Too quiet. No music, no television, no scent of candles or freshly brewed coffee. Tiffany always maintained a curated morning atmosphere, she treated ambience like armor. But today, the silence was deafening. He walked through the foyer and into the open-concept living room. Tiffany sat on the cream sectional sofa with her legs tucked under her, a large mug of tea balanced on her knee. She didn't look surprised to see him. "So," she said, not looking up from her mug. "Did you enjoy your little trip to the lake?" Brian set the documents down on the coffee table in front of her without responding. The slap of the papers against the glass echoed. Tiffany glanced at the pile, then back at her mug. "Let me guess. Your mother made you stop by every room and examine every drawer like an investigator." "I didn't need her help to see what was already obvious," he said. "You've been using the house as your personal retreat and rental business. Behind my back." Behind her back. She gave a humorless laugh. "Oh, please. It's not like she was going to use it. That place would have sat there, gathering dust, like everything else in her life. She never even knew about it," he said coldly. "Because you forged her signature. You redirected mail. You faked legal documents." Tiffany finally looked up. "Don't act like you didn't benefit. That house increased in value, and we've had additional income." Brian didn't move. "This isn't about profit. It's about trust. You violated it." "I protected your interests," she snapped. "You think your mother's going to manage a lake house alone? You really thought she'd move out there and be fine? You're delusional, Brian. I made the property useful." "You lied," he repeated. "You stole her gift and made money off it. That's not useful. That's predatory." Tiffany stood, slamming the mug down hard enough that tea splashed onto the table. "Oh, stop acting like I'm the villain here. Your mother's been coddled her entire life. You're just playing the perfect son now because you feel guilty about ignoring her for years." Brian's eyes hardened. "I ignored her because I believed someone else was keeping her involved. I believed you." She paced in front of the sofa, breathing fast now. "So what's the plan? You going to sue me? Go to the police? You think this is some kind of law and order episode?" He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Give me your phone." She stopped pacing. "What? You heard me. Your phone. Right now." Tiffany's lips parted in disbelief. "You don't have the right." "I'm your husband," he said, his voice like steel. "And we're about to find out just how much you've been hiding." When she didn't move, he stepped closer. "I will subpoena your records if I have to. But if you're telling me there's nothing to hide, hand it over." She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time in days, something flickered behind her eyes. Not anger. Not indignation. Fear. She slowly reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Brian took it and opened the gallery app. He didn't need her password, they shared the same facial recognition ID. Hundreds of images loaded. At first, they were innocuous. Selfies. Fashion. Food. Then came the house. Photos of Tiffany lounging on the deck, hosting dinner parties, arranging pillows on the master bed. She had documented it all. Not for herself, for her curated online life. He opened the messaging app next. That's where the real story lived. Text chains with friends confirming weekend bookings. Requests for house cleaning before new guests arrived. Messages boasting about how she was monetizing the lake house while Brian stays buried in code. And then he found something else. A conversation with someone named Delilah P. The tone was intimate, casual, and then, disturbingly transactional. "Tiff, we should do it again for New Year's. $1,500 for the weekend. They'll never check." "Delilah, are you sure your husband won't find out?" "Tiff, please. He barely knows what day it is. He thinks I'm still planning to surprise his mom with the house." Brian handed her back the phone without a word. Tiffany didn't look at him. She sat back down, staring at the carpet. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "At first it was just about managing things, making sure it didn't sit idle. But then, it got easier to keep going." "You were supposed to protect what I gave her," Brian said. "You turned it into a business. Into a lie." He sat across from her, the weight of betrayal thicker than the silence between them. "I'm hiring an attorney," he said. "Today." Her head snapped up. "What are you talking about?" "I'm getting our account separated. And I'm initiating proceedings." "You forged legal documents, Tiffany. That's not something we come back from." Her voice rose, desperate. "You're going to throw away our marriage over one mistake." He shook his head slowly. "This wasn't one mistake. It was a chain of choices, every one of them selfish. Every one designed to benefit you at someone else's expense. You didn't just steal a house. You stole a moment. A connection. You robbed my mother of something she could never get back." Tiffany stared at him, her face blank. "So that's it?" Brian stood, gathering the papers. "That's it." As he turned to leave, she didn't call after him. She simply sat there, surrounded by the perfect life she had built from borrowed parts. And for the first time, she seemed to realize it was already falling apart. Brian didn't drive straight home after leaving Tiffany in silence. Instead, he stopped at the law offices of Jensen, Morgan & Cole, a firm he had worked with during acquisitions in his startup days. This time, however, there were no contracts to review, no business partnerships to solidify. This was personal. By the time he walked through the glass double doors, the morning fog had burned off, but the chill clinging to him had nothing to do with the weather. In the conference room, Brian laid out the documents, screenshots, and messages he had collected. He explained everything, from the forged signatures to the unauthorized rentals. The firm's senior associate, Paula Jensen, reviewed the information with a grave professionalism. "This isn't just unethical," she said, sliding the forged proxy across the table. "It's criminal. She misrepresented authority, redirected mail to hide it, and profited off property she had no legal right to use. We can press charges." Brian shook his head. "I don't want to start with the police. Not yet. I want to make sure my mother is protected, and that Tiffany can't touch the house again. Can we freeze access? Yes, Paula nodded. We'll file a motion for an emergency injunction today. As long as the house is solely under your mother's name, and the fraudulent activity is documented, we can restrict Tiffany from accessing the property or its revenue streams. What about the bank accounts? Brian asked. We'll initiate an audit and start proceedings to separate marital and personal funds. But if she used household funds to furnish and rent the home, you may have leverage to reclaim damages. He leaned back, the tightness in his chest loosening slightly. Thank you. By the time he left the office, he had signed documents granting the firm power to represent both himself and his mother in the matter. Within hours, Tiffany would receive formal notice. She was no longer welcome at the lake house. Legally or otherwise. Back at Margaret's apartment that evening, Brian updated her over a quiet dinner. She listened carefully, her fingers gently curling around her teacup as he spoke. I don't want to drag this out, she said when he finished. But I'm glad we're not letting it go. She had no right. You won't need to do anything else, Brian assured her. The lawyers will take it from here. I don't mind stepping in if needed, Margaret said. I spent my whole life letting other people speak for me. Not anymore. The next morning, the process moved swiftly. Tiffany received the formal notification just before 10. Brian expected a storm of calls and texts, but none came. She was silent, at least for now. It was her silence that unsettled him the most, not out of guilt or grief, but calculation. Tiffany never stayed quiet unless she was preparing something. His suspicions proved right 2 days later. Paula called him mid-morning with a new development. Tiffany, it turned out, had listed the lake house under a short-term rental platform using a corporate shell, a company she had created quietly in Nevada 6 months earlier, under the name Silver Shore Retreats, LLC. She moved the rental income through a business account in the company's name, Paula explained. It's part of a deliberate attempt to obscure profit streams and delay detection. She knew exactly what she was doing, Brian muttered. We've already filed subpoenas with the hosting platforms, Paula continued. If any income was moved through this LLC, we'll trace it. But I have to warn you, this gives her room to claim partial business ownership, even if she had no legal rights to the property. Margaret was sitting across from him as he ended the call. She had overheard enough to understand. She used the house to build a fake business, she asked. She used your house to make money, then tried to bury it behind a shell company. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope she had received in the mail that morning. This came today, she said. It's from someone named Alexis. I didn't recognize the name until I opened it. Brian unfolded the letter and read aloud. Dear Mrs. Blake. I hope you don't mind me reaching out. I wanted to thank you for the beautiful stay at your lake home. Tiffany mentioned you were the owner, though she said you were too ill to manage the property yourself. She handled everything so professionally, the booking, the amenities, even the personal touches. I just wanted you to know how much I appreciated the opportunity. Best regards. Alexis K. Brian stared at the letter, fury building behind his eyes. She used your name to make herself look like a saint. Even lied about your health. Margaret's lips were pressed into a thin, hard line. I want this in the records. Every guest who thought I was involved, I want them corrected. Brian nodded. I'll forward it to Paula. Every lie she told, every thread she spun, we're going to untangle them all. That afternoon, while compiling documents to send to the legal team, Brian found a trail he hadn't noticed before, a bank account tied to Silver Shore Retreats, with a linked PayPal account that matched an email address Tiffany once used years ago. He dug further, tracing the payment history. Thousands of dollars had flowed through it in monthly installments. One of the line items read, Guest Reservation Refund, a transaction that didn't appear in any of the official logs. He clicked it open. The recipient was someone named Julian Case. Brian didn't recognize the name, but the memo left in the notes was chilling: refund due to unexpected visit from property owner's son. Who the hell is Julian Case? Brian muttered. He searched the name through his contacts, social media, even old emails. Nothing came up. Then he tried a reverse search on the phone number linked to the transaction. It took him to a public message board for short-term rental managers. One user, jcase_Omaha, had posted a message 6 months ago. Anyone ever had a client go behind their spouse's back to rent out family property? I was asked to refund a stay because the husband showed up unannounced. Feels sketchy, not worth the trouble. Brian's hands tightened on the mouse. Tiffany hadn't just used the house. She had been caught. And the refund proved it. He forwarded the message and the payment record to Paula immediately. That night, Tiffany finally texted. Tiffany, I need to talk to you. In person. One chance. That's all I ask. Brian read the message in silence. Then he replied. Brian, tomorrow. 10 o'clock. At the house. Because now, it wasn't her house anymore. And she would have to walk through the front door as nothing more than a guest. One without a key. The morning of the meeting arrived with a stillness that felt unnatural. No breeze stirred the pine trees that surrounded the lake house. The surface of the water outside was glass smooth, the kind of perfect calm that only made people more uneasy. Inside, Brian stood by the fireplace, his phone in one hand, the other resting on the back of a chair. He had arrived early, just after sunrise, to prepare. His mother had insisted on staying behind in Des Moines for this conversation, not out of fear, but because, as she put it, this part is yours to handle. At exactly 10 o'clock, a sleek black sedan pulled into the gravel driveway. Tiffany stepped out, her appearance as composed as ever. Her hair was neatly styled, her coat cinched at the waist, her heels somehow perfectly clean despite the muddy road. But something in her expression betrayed her. Her usual confidence was there, but beneath it lingered a tremor of something unspoken, a recognition that this time, she was not in control. She walked up the steps slowly, pausing before the door. When Brian opened it, neither of them spoke for several seconds. He stepped aside and let her in. The silence was heavy. Tiffany moved into the living room and looked around. The house had changed, not in decor, but in feeling. It no longer felt like hers to command. The subtle shift in authority was unmistakable. She noticed the absence of the framed pictures she had once proudly displayed. Margaret had removed them days ago, replacing them with nothing. A deliberate void. A statement. I didn't come to fight, Tiffany said quietly. You came because you realized it's over, Brian replied. She sat down on the edge of the couch, hands folded, eyes downcast. I made a mistake. Brian raised an eyebrow. Which one? She looked up, meeting his gaze. All of it. There was a long pause before he replied. Then say it. Say what you did. I took the house, she said. I used it. I profited from it. I forged documents. I lied to you. I lied to your mother. I manipulated the situation because I didn't think she'd ever want it, or know about it. Brian watched her. And? Tiffany's throat moved as she swallowed. And I tried to control something that wasn't mine. Because I was afraid. Afraid that if she became a part of your life again, I'd be pushed out. There it was. Brian didn't move. So you saw her as a threat. She always made me feel judged, Tiffany said. Not by what she said. But by how little she said. The way she looked at me. Like I was some gold-digging ornament you picked up on the way to the top. I knew she didn't think I belonged. Maybe because you never made an effort to prove her wrong, Brian said. Instead, you hid things. You lied. You fed that distance until it became real. Tiffany looked away, her eyes shining with restrained anger or maybe regret, it was hard to tell. You don't understand what it's like. You grew up with her. You already had a place in her heart. I had to carve out a space from nothing. You didn't carve it, Brian said coldly. You tried to erase hers. A tense silence followed. The only sound was the soft ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. Then Brian stepped forward. You remember the year we got married? She offered to help with the wedding, and you refused. Told her we didn't need her small-town touches. You told me it was about having a clean, modern theme. But now I wonder if it was really about control. Tiffany didn't answer. Brian continued, she offered to host Thanksgiving 2 years ago. You said we were going to be out of town. But we weren't. We stayed home and watched movies. You said she'd understand. She would've, Tiffany said. She always forgives you. Not anymore, Brian said. Her eyes flashed toward him, wounded. So what, this is it? You divorce me, kick me out of everything, pretend I never existed? No, Brian said calmly. I make sure you're held accountable. You don't get to walk away from this with silence. Not this time. Tiffany laughed bitterly. You think this is about some house and a few checks? You have no idea what you've started. Brian tilted his head. Then explain it to me. She hesitated, biting her lower lip, as though weighing whether to speak. Then she stood. Fine. You want the truth? I never thought I'd marry someone like you. You were a stepping stone, brilliant, but distracted. Generous, but naive. And your mother? She was always going to be the wall between me and everything you built. So you started chiseling away, Brian said. I built a brand. A company. I created income. I did what your precious mother never did, I brought something in. All she ever did was take your time, your attention, your guilt. I watched you twist yourself into knots trying to please a woman who'd already written me off. She never wrote you off, Brian snapped. She waited. She gave you every opportunity to be part of this family. You just never wanted her to be part of yours. They were standing now, inches apart. The tension was sharp, cold. You said this was just about talking, Tiffany said, her voice rising. Now what? You call the police? No, Brian said. I give you one option. Sign over everything, the company, the profits, the contracts you took under my mother's name, and walk away. Or we escalate. Her face tightened. You're threatening me. No, he said. I'm giving you a chance. One you didn't give her. Tiffany's breath caught in her throat. Brian stepped back. You have until tomorrow. Noon. Without waiting for a reply, he walked to the door and opened it. Tiffany lingered for a beat, then moved past him, head held high, but her shoulders, finally, seemed heavy. As she descended the steps, Brian stood in the doorway, watching until the car disappeared down the road. When he returned inside, the air felt clearer. It was the beginning of the end. Not just of a marriage built on illusions, but of the grip Tiffany had held on his family. And it was only the beginning of what Margaret deserved. Brian returned to Des Moines that same evening, driving in silence with the low hum of the engine barely noticeable beneath the rush of thoughts in his mind. The confrontation with Tiffany had closed a door that had been creaking for years. But what unsettled him more than anything was how close she had come to rewriting his entire intention, erasing the purpose behind the lake house, muting his mother's importance in his life without ever uttering her name. By the time he pulled into Margaret's apartment complex, the streetlights were flickering on and a light snow had begun to fall. He stepped inside her unit and found her seated at the kitchen table, reading a paperback novel, a small radio playing classical music in the background. The warmth of the space hit him all at once, not just the physical heat, but the calm, the steadiness, the presence of something genuine. Margaret looked up, removed her reading glasses, and set them gently on the table. "How did it go?" "She admitted it," Brian said. "All of it?" Margaret nodded slowly. "And?" "I gave her until noon tomorrow to sign over the company and the revenue contracts. Otherwise, we escalate to a civil suit. Paula's ready either way." Margaret's expression didn't change, but her voice carried more weight than usual. "And what about your marriage?" He sat down across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. "It ended long before this. I just didn't want to see it." "You wanted to believe the best in her," she said gently. "That's not a flaw, Brian." "No, but ignoring the truth is," he replied. "And I let it go too far. I didn't protect what mattered." Margaret reached out and placed her hand over his. "You're protecting it now." They sat in silence for several minutes, the music from the radio washing softly over them. "Would you come with me?" Brian asked suddenly. "To the lake house. Just for a night. I want you to see it again, not as a symbol of what was taken, but what's still yours." Margaret hesitated. "Brian, you don't need to prove anything to me." "It's not about proving," he said. "It's about reclaiming. I want to be there with you when it becomes home again." She smiled then, a soft, steady smile. "All right. Let's go." They left early the next morning. This time, Margaret brought a small overnight bag, not out of ceremony, but because she finally believed the house might become hers in truth, not just in name. The drive was quiet, but peaceful. When they arrived, the lake shimmered under the morning light, a thin mist rising above the water like breath in the cold. Inside the house, everything was just as Brian had left it. Margaret walked slowly through each room, her eyes lingering on the details she hadn't seen before, the way the sunlight caught the hardwood floors, the view from the upstairs bedroom, the small fireplace in the corner of the study. She stood by the back window, watching a pair of ducks glide across the lake's surface. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's yours," Brian reminded her. They spent the day unpacking the past, not literally, but emotionally. Margaret told him stories from when he was a child, memories of his father, summers spent near water, moments she had never shared before. They ate a quiet dinner in the kitchen, using the old ceramic plates she had brought with her, and afterward, they sat by the fireplace, letting the silence between them feel full rather than empty. Late that night, after Margaret had gone to bed in the master suite, Brian stepped outside onto the deck with a mug of tea. The sky was clear. Stars were spread like salt across a black canvas. He exhaled and listened to the creak of the wood beneath his feet, the occasional splash of fish near the shoreline, the distant hoot of an owl in the trees. He thought about how close he had come to never seeing this moment. How close he had come to letting it all slip through his fingers. Then his phone buzzed. It was a message from Paula. "Paula Jensen," she signed. "Everything is yours and your mother's. We'll begin dissolution procedures first thing Monday." Brian stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "Brian, thank you." He stood there for several minutes longer, watching the water, watching the stars, feeling the kind of clarity he hadn't known in years. The fight was over. The house was free. And more importantly, so was he. The next morning, they sat by the kitchen window, sipping coffee, watching the fog lift off the lake. "Do you think you'll stay here permanently?" he asked. Margaret looked out at the trees, the quiet path leading down to the dock. "Maybe. I think I need to feel it first. Let it settle." He nodded. "Take your time. There's no rush." She smiled at him. "Thank you, Brian." He reached across the table and took her hand. "No. Thank you. Because this wasn't just about a house. It was about the truth returning to its rightful place. And nothing, not fraud, not lies, not time, could take that back." 3 weeks later, the divorce proceedings had already begun to take form. Tiffany had remained unusually silent throughout the process, complying with every legal request but offering no commentary, no rebuttal, no apology beyond what had been said in that single confrontation at the lake house. Her silence was strategic, not remorseful, the kind that signaled calculation, not concession. Brian knew this because he recognized it now. Every layer of their life together that he had once mistaken for elegance or sophistication was, in hindsight, a screen for deeper currents of control. He continued working with Paula Jensen and her team to ensure that all revenue from the fraudulent rentals was accounted for. The money had been rerouted from Tiffany's business accounts and returned to a trust in Margaret's name. Tiffany, in turn, signed a legal agreement relinquishing all claim to the lake property and any future earnings from it. It seemed the damage was contained. But then, on a Tuesday morning just before Christmas, a delivery arrived at Margaret's apartment. Brian happened to be there when the knock came. He opened the door to find a courier holding a slim box and an envelope. The return address was a private legal office in Omaha, not Paula's firm. Brian signed, took the package, and set it on the dining table as Margaret looked on, her brow furrowed. He opened the envelope first. Inside was a formal notification: Tiffany had filed a countersuit. Not to reclaim the house or the money, but to claim intellectual property rights to the branding used under Silver Shore Retreats, LLC. Her claim was that while the company had been dissolved, the business name, logo, and guest experience model were her creative contributions, and should not be reused without attribution or compensation. Brian stared at the document, stunned. "She's not done," he muttered. Margaret looked at him carefully. "What does she want now?" "Leverage," he replied. "She's trying to drag this out, keep herself in the game. Make it hurt." He opened the box next. Inside was a single framed photograph. It was a picture of Tiffany at the lake house, standing on the deck at sunset, the lake glowing gold behind her. On the back was a handwritten note. "You can strip the name, the money, the papers. But you'll never erase what I created there. T." Brian said nothing. He took the frame, walked to the trash, and dropped it in without a word. 2 days later, Paula filed a motion to block the countersuit on the grounds of prior fraud and lack of standing. Within a week, it was dismissed. And just like that, Tiffany Blake was gone from their lives, not with a bang, but with the soundless retreat of a shadow no longer needed. In the weeks that followed, life returned to a gentle rhythm. Margaret visited the lake house often, gradually transferring small things from her apartment, a few framed photographs, her knitting basket, a porcelain vase she had inherited from her mother. She wasn't rushing, but rather testing each corner of the home with quiet intention. It was hers now, but she wasn't looking to conquer it. She was learning to inhabit it. Brian, meanwhile, made time to visit regularly. He would bring ingredients for recipes they used to cook when he was young: apple tarts, pot roasts, casseroles they hadn't made in decades. They sat by the fire in the evenings, talking not just about the ordeal behind them, but about everything else. The things that had been pushed aside during the chaos: stories of his father, memories of college, questions about where he was headed next. One afternoon, as they stood by the lake skipping stones, Margaret looked at him and said, "You know, I spent years thinking I'd done something wrong. That maybe I'd pushed you away without realizing it." Brian turned to her, stone still in hand. "You didn't." "I know that now," she said. "But I didn't know it then." He nodded slowly. "I let someone else tell me how to feel. I let her filter everything. And I didn't ask enough questions. I didn't listen to my gut." "Because you trusted her," Margaret said. "That's not weakness, Brian. That's love. Misplaced, maybe, but still love." He looked at her, eyes softening. "You deserve better than what I gave you." "I have it now," she replied. "And that's enough." As the holidays approached, the lake house transformed. Margaret decorated it modestly, a small pine wreath on the door, a few red candles along the mantel, a knitted garland across the window. It wasn't extravagant, but it was intentional. Every touch had meaning. And then, one snowy afternoon, as she organized some old boxes in the attic space above the garage, Margaret found something she wasn't expecting. A dusty cardboard container tucked behind storage bins, unmarked but sealed. Inside were more items from Tiffany's time, unused scented candles, guest cards, a few unopened envelopes addressed to rental clients. But at the very bottom was a sealed envelope, yellowed slightly with time. Her name was written on the front in Brian's handwriting. She opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, a real one. Not an email, not a printed contract. A letter he had written almost a year earlier. Mom. If you're reading this, I hope it's because the surprise worked. I wanted you to walk into the house without expectations, to feel something before thinking about it too much. I remember how you used to talk about living by the water. About mornings that started with quiet, and nights that ended with the moon on the lake. I bought this for you because I never forgot those stories. I know I've been distant. Life, work, marriage, they all got louder than I expected. But none of them replaced you. And nothing ever will. This is yours. No strings, no timelines. Just a place to breathe. Love. Brian. Margaret sat on the attic floor for a long time, holding the letter in both hands. Tears did not come immediately. What did come was a stillness, a profound sense of return, not to a place, but to a truth. Her son had never stopped caring. He had just been lost in the noise. Now, the noise was gone. And what remained was the only thing that ever mattered. The truth. The love. And the house that had finally found its way home. Winter had softened into early spring by the time Margaret officially moved into the lake house. The snow that once blanketed the trees had given way to damp earth and pale green buds along the shoreline. The lake, which had been frozen just months earlier, now rippled gently again, alive with the movement of geese and the whisper of returning warmth. Brian helped with the transition in full, not just lifting boxes, but organizing every drawer, wiping down every surface, making sure no remnant of Tiffany's influence lingered in the corners. Margaret didn't rush the process. She was deliberate with what she brought, curating the house not for image, but for comfort. Gone were the sleek, impersonal accents Tiffany had installed, replaced instead by weathered wooden frames with family photos, shelves lined with dog-eared paperbacks, crocheted blankets draped over armchairs. The house became a reflection of her, and in doing so, it became something new. Something whole. Brian visited often, at first every weekend, then sometimes unannounced during the week when he needed a break from the city. They fell into a rhythm quickly. He'd arrive with groceries or a new recipe he wanted to try. She would have coffee ready, or soup simmering on the stove. Sometimes they didn't speak much, just coexisted in a way that felt peaceful, restorative. There was no performance, no expectation. Just presence. One quiet morning in March, as they walked the narrow path that led to the edge of the lake, Brian picked up a small stone and tossed it across the water. The ripples spread outward, concentric and perfect. Margaret stood beside him, arms folded under her cardigan. "I didn't realize how much I missed this," he said. "Being near water?" she asked. "No. Being near you." She looked at him with a small smile. "I knew you'd find your way back. Eventually." He chuckled. "You say that like you never doubted it." "Oh, I doubted it plenty," she said, raising an eyebrow. "But doubt isn't the same as giving up." They continued along the path, past the old dock Brian had reinforced himself the month prior. As they reached a clearing near the reeds, Margaret stopped and turned to him. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. When you first met Tiffany, did you know? Deep down, I mean. Did something feel off?" He hesitated, then answered honestly. "There were moments. Things I brushed aside. I thought she was ambitious. Independent. Maybe even a little sharp. But I thought I needed that. Someone who could balance the chaos of my work. Someone who could keep me focused. But she didn't keep you focused, Margaret said gently. She kept you distant. He nodded. Yeah. She controlled the flow of my life. Subtly at first. And then, all at once. Margaret was quiet for a moment, then said, "Do you think she loved you?" "I think she loved the life," he replied. "And maybe the version of me that fit inside it. But not the real me." Margaret didn't press further. She just walked beside him as they headed back toward the house. Later that afternoon, Brian surprised her with something he'd been working on quietly, a photo album, meticulously assembled with prints from their time at the lake over the past few months. There were pictures of them cooking, laughing, bundled in coats beside the fireplace, even one of Margaret sitting alone on the porch reading a novel with her hair glowing silver in the sunset. She flipped through the pages slowly, her eyes misting. "I haven't had something like this in years. I wanted to give you something that couldn't be taken away," Brian said. "Something permanent." "It's more than enough," she said. That night, they made dinner together, Margaret's favorite lemon rosemary chicken and a warm apple crumble for dessert. As they sat down at the table, Margaret lifted her glass of sparkling water and raised it toward him. "To second chances," she said. Brian clinked his glass to hers. "To truth. To peace." After dinner, while cleaning up, Brian's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number. He hesitated, then picked up. "Hello." There was a pause, then a quiet voice on the other end. "Brian. It's Tiffany." He froze. "I know I shouldn't be calling," she said quickly. "But I heard about the house. That she moved in. That you're both doing well. What do you want, Tiffany?" "I'm not calling to fight," she said. "Or to claim anything. I've started therapy. I'm trying to figure out how I let it all get so twisted. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Again." Brian stood silent, watching his mother move gently around the kitchen behind him, humming faintly. "I'm hanging up now," he said. "I hope you find whatever you're looking for." And he did. No anger. No resentment. Just an ending. He turned the phone off and placed it face down on the counter. Margaret looked over at him. "Everything all right?" "Yeah," he said. "Everything's exactly as it should be." They sat in the living room afterward, a quiet fire glowing in the hearth, the photo album resting on the coffee table. Outside, the lake shimmered under the moonlight, and for the first time in a long while, the world felt still. Whole. And ready for whatever came next. It was a late afternoon in mid-April when Margaret finally opened the last of the boxes she had brought from Des Moines. The house at Lake Okoboji was no longer just a retreat, it had become her home. The corners were familiar, the scent of pine from the woods blended with the soft hints of lemon cleaner and old books, and the floors bore her rhythm now, the sound of her slippers in the morning, the gentle creak of the kitchen drawer she always meant to fix. The box was one of the older ones, marked only with a faded M in blue ink. Inside, she found a few photo albums, her late husband's pocket watch, a small wooden jewelry case, and a bundle of letters tied with twine. Most of them were decades old, holiday cards, notes from friends, her sister's handwriting from the 70s. But nestled beneath them, slightly newer in appearance, was an envelope without a stamp. Her name was written in thick, deliberate handwriting. She frowned. This wasn't one of hers, and it certainly wasn't her late husband's script. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single piece of stationery, the kind Tiffany used, branded with the initials, TB, faintly watermarked at the top. Margaret read the letter in full. "Margaret. If you're reading this, it's probably because everything has unraveled, and you found yourself back in the house. I won't waste your time pretending I deserve your attention, but I do want to say something I never had the courage, or the grace, to say in person. You were never my enemy. But I treated you like one. When I met Brian, I knew immediately he came from something solid. You, his history, his loyalty to you, it was the foundation of who he was. And I resented it. I wanted him to belong to my world, and that meant cutting away the roots he came from. I see now how wrong that was. The house was never mine, but I walked through it like it was. I saw it as a symbol, not of love, but of access. Status. Control. It wasn't about you. It was about the part of Brian I could never quite possess. I know you'll never trust me again. And I don't ask for redemption. But I want you to know that even if I did everything wrong, the one thing I know is this: he loves you. Deeply. Fiercely. Always did. I just got in the way. Whatever future you and Brian have now, I hope it's whole. And I hope, in some quiet corner of your life, there's room for a thought that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't all evil. Tiffany. Margaret sat very still after finishing the letter. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply folded the paper again, set it back into the envelope, and placed it in the drawer of her writing desk. Some truths weren't meant to be rewritten. But they could be acknowledged. And sometimes, that was enough. That evening, Brian arrived without warning, carrying a brown bag with groceries and a small bouquet of spring tulips. Margaret smiled when she opened the door and stepped aside to let him in. I figured we could make pasta, he said, setting the bag down. Something simple. As they cooked together, Margaret told him about the letter. She didn't dramatize it, nor did she quote it. She simply said, "Tiffany left me a note." She tried to explain herself. Not justify. Just, explain. Brian nodded slowly. Did it change anything? Not about her, Margaret said. But it helped me close the door with more clarity. They ate in the sunroom that evening, the glass panels framing a view of the lake as the sun dipped low, painting the water in golds and pinks. The world outside was alive again, birds returning, trees budding, the hush of new beginnings in the air. After dinner, they sat in the living room with their tea. Margaret opened the photo album Brian had made her and turned to a page they hadn't discussed yet, a candid shot of the two of them from behind, walking along the lakeshore, side by side. It had been taken by a neighbor they'd befriended, one who had quietly documented the moment without either of them noticing. It feels like a lifetime ago, Brian said. It feels like yesterday, Margaret replied. A silence settled between them, not the kind that needed filling, but the kind that confirmed something had found its rightful place. Outside, dusk settled. Later that night, long after Brian had gone back to the city, Margaret returned to the desk. She took out a sheet of her own stationery, pale blue, unmarked, and began to write. Dear Brian. When you were born, I made a promise to myself that I would always make space for you. Not just in my home, but in my heart, my choices, my silence. I never wanted to be the kind of parent who made their love conditional. But there were times when I let distance grow between us, not because I stopped loving you, but because I didn't know how to speak through the noise that your world had become. I thought if I waited long enough, you'd come back on your own. And you did, though not in the way either of us would have chosen. This house is more than a place. It's a bridge. A gift not just from you to me, but from who we were back to who we are now. And every time I walk through its rooms, I think of the boy who used to skip rocks and the man who remembered why he started. I am proud of you. And I am grateful. Love. Mom. She folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and set it on the table by the door. He would find it next time. Not because she needed him to read it now, but because some words are meant to be found in quiet moments, when the lake is still, and everything finally makes sense. The story of the house was no longer about betrayal, or property, or even forgiveness. It was about return. And it had, at last, come full circle.